We don't need to have judges making these decisions. We need voters to make these decisions.
It's appalling for the future of our country. We're not a country where we want the federal police state to decide who is or isn't running, and we don't want it to be decided by a small group of people behind the back of palace walls.
I do not believe Donald Trump should be prevented from being president of the United States by any court. I think he should be prevented from being president of the United States by the voters of this country. That's what I think.
Well, welcome to the National Newspaper Publicists Association's Let It Be Known. And we are hearing from more and more Republicans and others about the decision from the Colorado Supreme Court's ruling deeming former President Donald Trump constitutionally ineligible for the 2024 state primary ballot. Potentially, that ruling has far-reaching consequences. It not only reverberates within legal corridors, but also holds profound implications for the future of American politics. An eminent figure at Syracuse University, where he serves as a senior research associate at the Campbell Public Affairs Institute and the Michael O. Sawyer Chair of Constitutional Law and Politics, Professor Thomas Keck joins us to discuss the unprecedented ruling that bans Trump from the state's 2024 ballot, the next steps, the insurrection clause in the Constitution, and whether it does or should apply to other states. Welcome, Professor Keck. How are you?
Thanks, Stacey. Glad to be here.
It's good to have you. Thanks for taking some time out this afternoon. Let's jump right in on what I believe is on most people's mind, which is there was a stay in that ruling. So with that stay, I think it's January 4th. What happens next, and what happens if the U.S. Supreme Court either refuses to take this up or even delay its ruling to, say, after the primary?
Sure. So, it's a very unusual case, but this particular part of it is relatively routine. If a decision is going to be appealed to a higher court, often the court will put a temporary stay on its holding just to preserve the status quo until the appeal is fully resolved. So early January is the deadline for printing the ballots in Colorado. And so they said, if Mr. Trump appeals this decision to the U.S. Supreme Court, our stay will remain in effect until the U.S. Supreme Court gives some ruling. If Trump doesn't appeal, or if the Supreme Court says it's not going to hear the case, then the stay goes away automatically. And so the practical result is very likely that the U.S. Supreme Court will agree to hear the case, right? I mean, it seems like the kind of thing they're likely to step in on. They got a lot on their plate already, but I think they're going to step in on this one. And even if they accelerate their timetable, which they might try to do, it's not likely that Trump will actually be his name will actually be withheld from the ballot in Colorado's primary, right? Because the Supreme Court will probably still be sitting on the case. But what matters most is that if the Supreme Court hears it and they're able to rule on it, by the end of their term, which is usually late June, that's in advance of the Republican National Convention, right? So, like in theory, if the court declared Trump ineligible for the presidency, the Republican Party would have time to find somebody else. So what's most important is not what happens with Colorado's ballot, but what happens nationally.
Okay, so Professor, so that ruling in the state Supreme Court in Colorado, so it does in fact affect other states as well, is what I'm hearing.
No, not directly, but any subsequent U.S. Supreme Court ruling would potentially affect the whole country, right? So the particular result of this holding is only that Trump is potentially removed from the primary ballot in Colorado. But if the U.S. Supreme Court hears arguments in the case and upholds the Colorado decision, then that potentially leads to Trump being disqualified from the ballot everywhere else as well. Yeah.
So that's the fact that it's being kicked to the U.S. Supreme Court, at least Trump has a right to take this to the Supreme Court, right? The fact that it's going that route, it could have the implications could be what you just laid out, that they could say, hey, Colorado got it right, and we have to go along with this, or we are ruling along with this, and that is going to force the GOP to, it's pretty much, if Trump wins their nomination, to find another nominee.
Correct. I'm not predicting that, but that
No,
could
no, not at all.
that could in fact happen. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's interesting because we've been looking at it from a purely a Colorado standpoint. But
Right. And the other piece of it is that there are similar suits that have been filed in multiple different states,
yes,
right? And so essentially the way it works is if the court, the Supreme Court, the National Supreme Court gives a definitive ruling, then all of those other courts here in all those other cases instantly adopt whatever the Supreme Court said the rule's supposed to
gotcha.
be. And so then it gets applied everywhere, usually fairly quickly and routinely. Yeah.
Wow. So that is amazing because again, thanks for clarifying that because you've brought the broader picture here, which I don't, even not just us, but I haven't really seen the discussion go there with other broadcasts or other outlets. So it's good to know that. But now comes word, Professor, that the Colorado Republican Party is threatening to switch its presidential nominating process from a primary to a caucus system. What's the difference, Professor, and why does that matter? And can they legally do that in the face of the state Supreme Court's ruling?
Oh, so I hadn't heard that latest development. So I don't know exactly whether they can do that because it would be a matter of Colorado election law, right? Which which I'm not an expert on. And so, but in theory, at least in some states, right? It is, political parties have some amount of control over how they choose their own candidates, right? Because they're
Right.
private organizations and the Constitution protects their rights to engage in politics however they want and choose their own candidates. And that's all governed by state and federal election law, but the parties do have some discretion. So in theory, in some states, depending how the election law is written, a party could get around the ban on their candidate appearing on the primary ballot by adopting a nominee in a different way. The problem for Colorado Republicans is that this particular holding from the state Supreme Court is focused on the primary ballot because that's the immediate question that had to be decided because those are going to get printed in a couple weeks. But the logic of their opinion applies just as clearly to the general election ballot, right? So according to the Colorado Supreme Court, I don't think Trump would be allowed to appear on the November ballot in Colorado either, no matter how they select him. But of course, the U.S. Supreme Court might weigh in and change that.
So we're talking about they use Section 3, I should say, of the 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868. But though the clause was aggressively enforced against ex-Confederates for several years following its ratification, has been used in only a handful of cases since 1872. So this is a really big deal, right?
For sure. It's a huge deal. I mean, it's, the Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, as you said, so it's adopted after the Civil War. It's an intentional effort by Congress to prevent the leaders of the Confederacy from returning to power, right? And they're like, if you held office, and so you took an oath to defend the Constitution, and then you violated that oath by declaring war against your own country, right, then you shouldn't be allowed to hold office anymore. That was the intense and express purpose of it. It has not often been enforced, although, frankly, that's mostly because we don't have insurrections most of the time. So, like who are you going to enforce it on? But it's clear that the wording of the text is pretty clear, and the historical background of the text is pretty clear, and the events of January 6th are, they seem to fit, right? They seem to fit. And so it's unusual both because the stakes are so high and because we haven't used this provision of the Constitution in so long, but that doesn't mean it doesn't fit the facts of the case, Yeah.
Well, and we notice 25 other states have cases or at least have filed lawsuits. There's been lawsuits in 25 other states challenging Trump's candidacy. How might that, and one of our viewers is asking that question too, how might that affect him in other states, if at all?
So yeah, and if you look at the map of those states, right, some of them are more important states than Colorado. Colorado is not really a swing state in the presidential election, but there's lawsuits in Arizona and Michigan and Wisconsin, right, states that in recent cycles have been very close, and that Trump obviously has a chance to win in those states. I don't think he has as much of a chance to win in Colorado. And so if Trump were excluded in the ballot from the ballot in Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, that would be a bigger deal than getting excluded from the ballot in Colorado. It's a little bit hard to game out and predict exactly what's going to happen. Things are going to be moving fast, but most likely we get a definitive answer from the U.S. Supreme Court one way or the other before the November election, like in time, so that each party can actually have a candidate on the ballot of one sort or another. And so ideally, right, whichever way it comes out, I think ideally the U.S. Supreme Court gives us a clear and definitive answer that applies equally across the country. And so it's not like Trump's going to be on the ballot in most states, but not in Wisconsin and Michigan, and that makes it harder for him to win. Like that would be particularly weird. That's possible, but I don't think it's going to go that way because I think the Supreme Court will give us a definitive nationwide answer one way or the other.
Yeah, so this idea that most people looking at this saying, well, we have to have a decision before the primary. That's not the case, is what you're saying. As long as that decision comes down before the election, is the general election is really what's important, it seems like.
Yeah, I mean, there are timing issues, right? And so like if the decision came out like right before the November election and they said Trump was disqualified, that would be chaos. But if it came out at the beginning of the summer, I mean, no matter what happens, it's going to be controversial. But if the Supreme Court ruled that Trump was disqualified in June, then in theory, the Republican National Convention would be an opportunity for them to pick a replacement candidate who would still have time to appear on the ballot everywhere. So I'm quite sure that the U.S. Supreme Court will be cognizant of that timeline. But yeah, the early January deadline seems to me less important than that. Yeah.
And Professor, you teach students about the Supreme Court. As an educator, particularly about the Supreme Court, how important is it, no matter what side of the aisle you stand on or someone may stand on, how important is it, for them to get it right in a case like this, because it's like you said, it's very controversial. But the other part of this is, we know that Donald Trump appointed 3 of those justices on the high court, and it's a 6-3 majority, conservative majority. How important it is to show the students that regardless of conservative or liberal, if you are sitting on that court, it should not, only thing should matter is the rule of law. How important is this case when it comes to that?
It's big for sure. So, what I would say is that, what I tell my students is that, the court is pretty obviously a political institution in some ways. I'm a political scientist and I study the Supreme Court because it's a political institution in some ways. The students who, as soon as they read about the Supreme Court reversing Roe versus Wade after 50 years, right after Trump had appointed 3 conservative justices, right, they can see that on their own. But what I also tell them is, like, at its best, the court, and it often falls short of this in practice, but at its best, the court is a principled actor. Like the legal questions that the court decides are often quite challenging with legitimate arguments on both sides, but they don't answer those questions purely in the way that Donald Trump or Joe Biden would try to answer them, right? They don't just look at it with a directly political lens. And one way we can tell that is because sometimes the justices don't divide up into those 6-3 partisan camps. Yes. At its best, right?
At its best.
But there's periods in the court's history. This is not the first one, right? But this is one of them. There's periods in the court's history where the court basically gets captured, is a sort of pejorative way to put it, by one partisan coalition. and they appear to have a fairly aggressive kind of agenda in mind of like, we've been mad at Roe versus Wade for a long time. Now we're going to get rid of it. We've been mad at affirmative action for a long time. Now we're going to get rid of it. Right. And so like over and over and over, case after case after case, divided on those partisan lines, they're pushing the law in their preferred direction. And when it's happened before in the court's history, there's always been political pushback, and the pushback is bad for the court. Like sometimes the justices eventually sort of realize, like, oh man, like Congress and the president are coming for us. They might try to change the size of the court or do something, right? Because we're pushing too aggressively, and then sometimes the court kind of backs off a little. So if you think about it from the conservative justices' perspective, on the one hand, some of them might very much want to help Trump out, right? There's the legal questions, but if we're setting aside the legal questions for a second, on the one hand, some of them might very much want to help Trump out and make sure they're not harming the Republican Party in next year's election. On the other hand, some of them might want to like sort of buttress the court's reputation. And if Trump's own appointees rule against Trump, that's a pretty strong signal that the court is not just a partisan institution, And the best example of that we have in my lifetime, barely, is the Watergate case.
Right.
Right. Where Nixon's justices all ruled against him. Right. Yeah. I mean, like he had just appointed them and they all ruled against him. And then he stepped down. Right. And so like that's a good lesson for the court.
That's a great point. Yeah. Glad you brought that out. But to go along with that again, because you think about the court, and in particular, you have a guy named Justice Clarence Thomas, whose wife participated in Stop the Steal rallies. She's intricate in this alleged, or however you put it, insurrection. That's not alleged, but she's has been implicitly linked to that. The question is, should he recuse himself?
Yeah, Ginny Thomas was texting back and forth with President Trump's chief of staff, Mark Meadows, throughout the period from the November 2020 election to January 6th, urging him to be more aggressive in trying to get the election results switched. So, yeah, she's deep implicated in it for sure. So the Supreme Court's gotten a lot of bad press in recent months and years for ethics controversies, a bunch of which have involved Justice Thomas, and for this kind of recusal issue in particular. And I mean, Thomas has not given any indication with respect to any prior cases that he cares about the sort of bad look of him, because there's been some earlier sort of like procedural motions and stuff where the court has weighed in on some stuff relevant to January 6th, and Thomas has not recused himself from any of those. And so there's no reason to believe that he's going to do anything different this time. And I do think it's a bad look for the court. I also think, the court's rules, and they have reiterated this over and over again, is that it should be up to each individual justice to decide whether there's reason for recusal. That's not the only way to do it. You could have like the court as a whole sort of decide, but their rules have always been each justice can be trusted to decide that for herself. And so they're not going to change that, in the middle of this case,
Right.
Yeah.
Well, again, you teach students and listen, the young ones, particularly, there's a great argument that young ones today are probably the most intelligent generation, right? And you're teaching them about the Constitution, about the Supreme Court, which entails the Constitution. How do you explain to a student today if Trump, in this case, if not Trump, but if Clarence Thomas doesn't recuse himself, and if Trump goes on to get the U.S. Supreme Court to rule in his favor, how do you, knowing what we know, how do you talk to these students today?
So, I mean, I guess it's a great question. And I guess one of my sort of tactics is just to kind of compare stuff that's happening today with stuff that has happened previously in our history. And sometimes it just helps the students get a little perspective and sort of, take it out of the immediate, like divisive, polarized conflict and talk about the same issues, but in a different context, and then bring it back. And so the fact is, I gave you a story about the Supreme Court at its best, like standing up for principles of our constitutional democracy and the like, and uniting across partisan lines. And they do that sometimes. But the fact is they've often fallen short of that ideal. And so there are previous examples of corrupt Supreme Court justices. There are previous examples of the court ruling in partisan ways. And so like the institution is far from perfect, and there's ways that we could improve it, right? There's things that Congress could do to kind of send some signals to the court about the kinds of procedures it's following, what its rules for recusals are, what kinds of ethics requirements they have for disclosure of gifts, and all of that kind of stuff. Like there's stuff we could do to improve it. Even just talking about it and learning about it kind of helps create a little bit more public pressure. But obviously, if Congress could actually like weigh in on it, there's stuff they could do to improve the operations of the Supreme Court. Some people want to get rid of it. They think the court has gone so far off the deep end that I don't go that far, but I do think there's a lot of room for improvement. And so teaching students that the court has done some good stuff in our constitutional history, but it has also periodically succumbed to some very bad temptations that have undermined our democracy. Like that balance is not doesn't get, like just get maintained by itself, right? That requires like constant vigilance and the like.
Yeah, we've seen. Listen, we've seen American democracy under attacks before, but we've not seen it this severe. You political science, you've studied a lot. What has happened to American democracy, the political scene in America? What has happened that we are now at this point where you hear, prior to us starting this conversation, our producer, great producer, she played comments made by Chris Christie and Vivek Ramaswamy and others who said, you can't go after Donald Trump like this. This is wrong. When clearly the Colorado Supreme Court was going by the law. So what has happened, and are we at a point where we just accept that a president now is above the law?
Yeah, no, that's a big question. So there's a lot wrong with American democracy at the moment, and some of them, some of the problems go back way farther than Donald Trump. But some of them are new, or at least newly exacerbated by Donald Trump for sure. But there's a lot of deep-seated problems, right? So just to like flag a couple kind of dimensions of the problem. So one is there's, like our democratic institutions are old, right? So like we have the oldest continually operating written constitution in the world, which has some advantages in terms of like stability and the like. But also, it's super hard to update. And so the design of like our electoral college in the 18th century does not work perfectly anymore. And it could really use some updating, right? So that's a bunch of long running problems that are not Trump's fault, although Trump has been able to like exploit them in some ways. Trump is, and this is not a uniquely American thing. There's lots of countries in the world that have faced like a kind of strong man, kind of authoritarian. It's almost always a man, kind of authoritarian minded leader who is able to exploit the vulnerabilities in the existing democratic process and get himself into power, and then try to rig the game in all kinds of ways to stay in power. That's happening all over the world, and it's clearly happening here. And one of the lessons, so like my colleagues in political science who study some of this, we call it democratic backsliding in other parts of the world, where you got a functioning democracy, and then it seems like maybe it's like not acting so democratic anymore. One of the big lessons of those stories from elsewhere in the world is that if your democracy is going to kind of stay robust and sort of survive those threats, like the people elected somebody who seems like he's intent on weakening our democracy, like can we survive that or not? One of the big tests is, are political leaders from that guy's own party, are they willing to stand up to him, right? Which might cost them, right? Like think about my congressman here in Syracuse was a Republican named John Katko, who voted for Trump's impeachment, the second one, and then he retired because there was no way he was going to win again, right? He was going to get primaried, and so like he sacrificed his own career, right? We've seen other folks do that, but like That's what you got to do. Like, what's more important, like your career or like the survival of American constitutional democracy? And just like those comments that you opened the show with, Christie and Ramaswamy and all the Republican candidates who allegedly are running against Donald Trump, even they are
I like how you said
unwilling.
allegedly, by the way. Go ahead.
Even they are unwilling often to call him out. Chris Christie calls him out more than the rest of them does, but even
Right.
he says, no, we should let the voters decide. And I'm just like, let the voters decide sounds good, but like if you're talking about a blatant violation of a clear provision of the Constitution, like why would we say that enforcing that is optional? Or like, it's the legal arguments are there. They should play out in court. We hope the court will decide them fairly. And we need more, not fewer, more Republican leaders standing up saying the fundamental rules of our constitutional democracy are more important than the short-term electoral fortunes of my party.
Yeah.
Republican judges they got a chance to still do that, right? If this goes to the U.S. Supreme Court, it means it is up to Republican judges to decide. The Republican presidential candidates are not doing a great job. The Republican judges still have a shot. They still got a shot.
Isn't that ironic?
Yeah.
But and then we got a couple of minutes left. And again, thanks for joining us, Professor. So let's just do a suppose thing again. Just suppose they rule again in favor of the former president. The Supreme Court does, right? What does that say? Because it looks like it's a clear-cut violation of the Constitution, and which is what the Colorado State Supreme Court found, right? The majority of the Colorado Supreme Court. What does that say about the Constitution anymore? Doesn't that open the door for other provisions of the Constitution to be overlooked?
Well, it's a great question. And again, our Constitution is 200 years old, and there's, it doesn't enforce itself. And it's, and so it doesn't always work the way it's supposed to work. Just take impeachment, right? The framers of our Constitution explicitly recognized the danger that somebody might come into office and then abuse their powers and try to stay in office forever. They literally talked about that at the Constitutional Convention. Once they're in power, they might use their power to try to tinker with the rules of the game and try to stay there forever. And so what's their mechanism for dealing with that? Impeachment. If they do something bad enough, abuse their powers, we don't have to wait for the next election. Here's a mechanism where Congress can remove them from office and bar them from holding office again, right? And so Trump's second impeachment, January 2021, after January 6th, right? The House impeached him. I want to say like 10 Republican members of the House voted for that. Not enough, but at least some of them did. And then it goes to the Senate. Everybody knows he was guilty, right? I mean, it was like it had all happened on TV. Like everybody knows he riled up this mob. And with a small handful of exceptions, right, Republican senators voted to acquit him. Like that was like the framers gave us the lifeboat, right? I mean, that was like impeachment was explicitly designed for that. And Republican senators didn't do it, right? They could have barred him from holding office. We would not be having this conversation today. We'd be all set. I don't know who the Republican nominee would be, DeSantis or Haley or somebody, but it would not be Donald Trump because he'd be legally barred from office, right? All right, that one didn't work. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is another lifeboat, right? Is it perfect? It might not be perfect, but the framers of the 14th Amendment gave us another lifeboat. All right, if somebody violently tries to overthrow the government and seize control of power, they're legally barred from holding office again. We got to figure out how to enforce it, but that's a constitutional mechanism that is there for precisely this situation, and it is not clear that this one might not work either, right? And
yeah. Well, and finally, let me ask you this, and Professor Keck, globally, on a global scale, international community, how are we being viewed? How is America being viewed at this moment?
Well, that's a good question. I've been busy reading the 200-page opinion that came out last night, so I haven't been looking at the foreign headlines yet.
But what's the implications, though?
But I will say, so here's the thing. So for U.S. allies, right, the historical U.S. allies, Western Europe and the like, the first Trump presidency was a trying time, right? Because he was constantly proving himself to be an unreliable partner, right? And now, Biden's been in, and so things went back to normal a little bit, but they're all like, well, we don't know. Like, is NATO stable and reliable? We don't know because Trump might get back in there again.
Right.
For traditional U.S. adversaries or rivals on the global stage, think about Putin's Russia in particular, right? I mean, they are intentionally inflaming divisions in the U.S. in order to try to help Trump's prospect. And they are banking on, right, if Trump comes back into power, then U.S. support for Ukraine is going to collapse, right? And then Russia's kind of got the road paved for it again. So it's like the signal of instability in American democracy and America as an unreliable partner for our fellow democracies throughout the world. That is a very bad signal. And that is the signal that we're currently sending to the world. And again, the court, like in theory, like, the court's trying to figure out the meaning of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment drafted in 1868. Like, they don't, like, in theory, they're not paying attention to global foreign policy concerns. But that stuff's got to be in the back of their minds, right? Like, why? Wait a minute. Like, Trump's going to come back in and he's going to destroy NATO and he's going to give Putin a green light and all this other stuff. Like, does John Roberts and Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett, do they want to be part of? Do they want that to be part of their legacy? That I think is a tough question for them.
Wow. Well, he is a senior research associate at the Campbell Public Affairs Institute and the Michael O. Sawyer Chair of Constitutional Law and Politics, Syracuse University. Professor Thomas Keck, thank you so much for joining the Black Press's Let It Be Known. We appreciate you.
Stacey, thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching, everybody.